The fan wasn't working. Heat clung to the canvas walls like wet cloth thick enough to choke on. In a dim field hospital tent somewhere on Luzon, August 12, 1945, 9 o'clock at night, two Japanese women in tattered uniforms stood frozen beside a narrow cot. The air smelled of disinfectant, sweat, and something else. Fear, maybe. Or just the humid rot of tropical night pressing in from all sides. Sergeant Frank Morrison's voice was flat, more exhaustion than authority, more statement than order. You'll share this bed with us tonight. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the flies seemed to stop mid-buzz. The younger woman, barely 22, felt her throat close. Her hands found the makeshift rosary at her waist. 2 safety pins tied with thread. Not much, but it was something to grip when the world stopped making sense. The older nurse, 28, was already counting exits. 2, 12 feet to the tent flap. Guards outside. Rifles. Nowhere to run. Her mind moved fast, cataloging, calculating. 4 Americans. 8 if you counted the ones sleeping in the corner. Too many. Way too many. Kimiko whispered in Japanese, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own pulse. Kore wa shio imisuru. This means death. Haruko said nothing. She just watched. Watched as the Americans unbuckled their belts. Watched as they pulled off their boots. Watched as one of them, a young Chinese American with hollow eyes, collapsed onto the cot without even glancing their way. He was shaking. Fever, probably. Malaria. His arm fell limp off the side of the canvas frame. Better to die, Kimiko whispered again. Better to die than this. But the guard outside just shrugged. He didn't speak Japanese. Didn't need to. The message was clear enough. No spare cots, no spare tents, just heat and sickness and sleep. The kind of bone-deep weariness that turned men into ghosts. As night pressed in through the seams of the tent, the Americans dropped their rifles. Just leaned them against the tent pole 15 feet away. Unguarded, one medic, his face sunken from weeks of fever, and too little food, collapsed first. His breathing was heavy, wet. The sound of a man who'd seen too much and couldn't unsee it, no matter how hard he tried. The 2 women tensed, waiting for hands, waiting for violence, waiting for the propaganda to prove itself right. Then nothing. No touch, no words. Only the heavy rhythm of men who'd run out of everything except the need to sleep. Outside, rain began to hiss on the tarpaulin roof, a soft percussion that might have been soothing in another life. Inside, shame and confusion battled in silence. Haruko felt her jaw clench. Kimiko felt her throat tighten with fear and disbelief that threatened to spill over into something she couldn't name. Why weren't they doing what they were supposed to do? Why weren't they proving the empire right? In her homeland, surrender meant unending disgrace. Dishonor worse than death. Every lesson, every lecture, every slap from a superior officer had driven that home. Capture was not an option. Survival was not an option. There was only victory or death, and death with honor was infinitely preferable to life without it. Here the enemy simply snored beside her. Reports would later estimate more than 4,000 Japanese women were captured across Southeast Asia that year. Most were nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, not fighters. For them, captivity wasn't just loss. It was social death. The kind that follows you home, that marks you, that makes you a ghost in your own family. But something unexpected was happening in that tent. Something the empire had never prepared them for. Hours later, Haruko realized her trembling had stopped. She could hear one American muttering in his sleep. Something about home, cornfields maybe, and a name she couldn't quite catch. Tommy Tammy. The syllables were soft, slurred with depletion. She turned her face toward the canvas ceiling, eyes open in the dark, realizing something that cut deeper than any blade. The war hadn't just taken nations. It was unraveling everything she'd been taught about mercy and monsters, about who deserved kindness and who deserved cruelty, about what it meant to be human when the world said you weren't allowed to be. And when morning light bled through the seams of the tent, pale and sticky, she knew the bed wasn't just wood and fabric anymore. It was a question, the kind that would haunt her through every sunrise after this one, the kind that would follow her home and sit beside her for 42 years until she finally found the courage to speak it aloud. But that morning was still decades away. Right now it was just dawn, and the women still hadn't moved much. Dawn crawled into the tent with all the enthusiasm of a man walking to his own execution. Pale light, sticky heat already building. The Americans were gone off to their duties before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. But the cot stayed warm with leftover body heat. Haruko could still feel it against her back. Strange how warmth could feel like accusation. For the first time since their capture, the silence wasn't filled with shouting or orders. Just breathing. The slow, steady rhythm of two women trying to remember who they were before all this. Kimiko blinked hard, her eyes dry and burning. She was trying to remember. Trying to pull up the image of herself from 3 weeks ago. The version that believed in something. The version that had purpose and direction and a future that made sense. Weeks earlier, in the jungles of Luzon, they had been called Angels of the Empire. Their task was simple, at least on paper. Tend to wounded soldiers. Young men bleeding out under slogans of eternal victory. Keep them alive long enough to fight again. Ignore the fact that there were never enough bandages, never enough morphine, never enough rice. When the American counterattack swept through in mid-1945, their hospital unit crumbled like wet paper. Out of nearly 200 personnel, only a handful survived the initial artillery barrage. Haruko could still see the bamboo walls exploding inward, could still hear the screams that ended too quickly. When surrender came, the nurses were shaking, some still clutching scalpels as if they could fight off tanks with surgical steel, as if will alone could stop what was already inevitable. American soldiers found them hiding beneath banana leaves, uniforms shredded, faces caked with mud, eyes wild with the kind of fear that comes from knowing exactly what you think is about to happen. They expected execution. Clean, quick, merciful compared to the alternative. Instead, they were given water. The contradiction was unbearable. The Empire had trained them under the Bushido Code. Death before capture. Honor above all. To live as a prisoner was treason. To be touched by the enemy was unthinkable. Worse than death. Worse than anything. One nurse, a woman Haruko barely knew, whispered as they were being loaded onto trucks. Americans kill all prisoners. That's what the officer said. That's what the radio said. That's what everyone said. But they didn't kill them. By mid-1945, American field reports showed Japanese surrenders had increased nearly sixfold compared to earlier in the war. The myth of the invincible soldier was breaking down. Slowly, painfully. One shattered unit at a time. Still, the women didn't know whether survival was mercy or punishment, whether they were being kept alive for some purpose too horrible to imagine, whether the execution was just delayed, drawn out, made worse by hope. Inside the camp, they were separated from male prisoners, but not always from danger. Rumors spread like disease. Some women vanished in chaotic transfers between camps. Others ended up in field hospitals like this one, where the line between patient and prisoner blurred until it barely existed. Here, fever didn't respect uniforms. Infection didn't care about nationality. Death was an equal opportunity employer, and the medics treated it like the enemy it was. That night's order to share a bed wasn't cruelty. It was logistics, cold practical math. Too few cots, too many bodies, too little energy left to care about etiquette or protocol or the invisible rules that governed who could sleep near whom. Yet for these women, it was the shattering of everything they'd been raised to believe. About purity, about duty, about shame, about what it meant to be female in a world built by men who saw them as symbols rather than people. As Haruko folded the thin blanket that morning, she noticed the tag stitched into its corner. Small letters, faded but still legible. U.S. Army Medical Department. She ran her thumb over the words. The same men who had bombed their cities, who had killed their soldiers, who had reduced entire islands to ash and blood, were now the ones preventing them from freezing in the tropical rain. She couldn't decide if that made them monsters or something even more dangerous. Human, and as night approached again, the confusion would only deepen. Night returned with the same heavy air. Thick. Still. Buzzing with insects that seemed to feed on weariness itself. The tent was half dark except for the faint glow of a kerosene lamp hanging from the center pole. Its light flickered with each breath of wind, casting shadows that danced across canvas walls like restless spirits. The two Japanese nurses sat stiffly at the edge of the cot, waiting again. waiting for what they were sure would come eventually. Every instinct screamed at them to run. But beyond the tent lay mud and wire and rifles. Inside lay uncertainty, which was somehow worse. Kimiko's fingers trembled as she gripped her makeshift rosary. She whispered under her breath, so quiet even Haruko barely heard. It will happen now. Tonight. It has to. But it didn't. One soldier, too sick to care about anything beyond the next breath, dropped onto the cot beside them. His boots were still on, his breathing ragged and wet. Another soldier leaned against the tent pole and passed out upright, his head lolling forward onto his chest. The nurses waited, bodies rigid, muscles locked. Minutes turned to hours, each one stretching longer than the last. Then they realized something almost insulting in its simplicity. The Americans didn't even see them as women tonight, just more bodies on a crowded floor, just more warm shapes taking up space in a tent that smelled of sickness and sweat and defeat. By dawn, the cot had become something else entirely. Not a battlefield, not a place of violation, just a no man's land, a ceasefire written in shared fatigue. The bed wasn't a weapon, it was a truce no one had bothered to announce. Haruko studied the medic's hands while he slept. They were cracked and dirty nails broken down to the quick. But even in sleep, they looked careful. Positioned carefully on his chest, fingers curled gently like he was holding something precious he didn't want to break. How could the same hands bandage wounds by day and kill by night? Or maybe they didn't kill. Maybe that was the point. Maybe medics were different. Maybe that's why they were still alive. The tent reeked of disinfectant and sweat, a sharp chemical smell that burned the back of the throat. Temperatures hovered around 90 degrees even at night, even with the broken fan that rattled uselessly in the corner. Malaria patients groaned in nearby cots, fever dreams spilling out into the thick air. Ration crates doubled as pillows. 12 cots for 30 soldiers. The math didn't work, but the army made it work anyway. Logistics didn't care about comfort. Logistics didn't care about shame. The Americans had learned to sleep anywhere. Foxholes, trucks, broken barracks, mud. To them, this tent was just another night. Another day survived. Another sunrise that meant they hadn't died yet. But to the captured nurses, it was identity collapse. The total destruction of every belief they'd built their lives around. We thought they'd defile us, Haruko would later recall in a voice that still trembled 4 decades after the fact. But they only snored beside us. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was depletion so deep it turned into neutrality. Yet neutrality itself felt like mercy. Outside guards changed shifts, boots squelching in mud. The sound of men moving through routines so familiar they could do them blind. The women stayed awake, confused, alert, watching the tent breathe with every gust of wind that managed to slip through the gaps in the canvas. Kimiko realized her fear was mixing with something else now. Curiosity, maybe, or just a weariness so complete that even fear couldn't hold on anymore. What kind of enemy sleeps without guarding his weapon? The question hung in the humid air. Unanswered, unanswerable. As the first light hit the medic's face, catching on the stubble of his jaw and the dark circles under his eyes, Kimiko caught herself feeling something forbidden, something she didn't have a name for yet. Relief, and that small crack of safety was about to open into something she never expected. A moment of care that would rewrite everything she thought she knew about enemies and mercy and what it meant to survive. The rain hadn't stopped in 2 days. It drummed on the canvas like endless gunfire, a sound so constant it became silence, seeping through seams, pooling beneath the cots, turning the ground outside into a swamp that grabbed at boots and refused to let go. Fever had taken hold of Kimiko. Her lips were pale, almost gray, her pulse faint and thready when Haruko pressed fingers to her wrist. The older nurse knelt beside her, unsure whether to ask for help or let fate decide. Pride and fear warred inside her chest. That's when a shadow crossed the tent flap. An American medic, early 20s maybe, mud caked to his knees, dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He was holding a dented canteen in one hand, his medical bag in the other. His eyes were the color of complete depletion. He didn't speak Japanese. She didn't understand English. But he could see her fear sharp and bright in her eyes, and she could see his tiredness deeper than bone. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the canteen, gestured for her to drink, made the motion clear. Water. Safe. Drink. Haruko hesitated. Every instinct warned her it was a trick. Poison, maybe, or something worse. Some kind of drug that would make her compliant, make her weak, make her everything she'd sworn never to become. But thirst was stronger than pride, stronger than fear, stronger than everything the Empire had taught her about never accepting anything from the enemy. The first sip burned like life itself. Cool water hitting a throat so dry it had forgotten what moisture felt like. She gasped, drank again, deeper this time. The medic nodded once, just once, then pulled a wool blanket from his pack and draped it over both women without ceremony, without waiting for thanks or permission or acknowledgement. "Share it," he muttered in English. The words were meaningless to her, but the gesture was universal. "Two of you, one blanket. Figure it out." Then he walked away, just turned and left, didn't look back, didn't wait to see if they'd accept it, didn't treat it like some grand act of charity that required gratitude or recognition. That small gesture, so ordinary to him, felt seismic to them. The wool smelled of sweat and disinfectant and something else, something that might have been tobacco or might have been just the smell of American supply depots. It was rough against her skin, heavy, warm despite the humidity. Yet it carried something impossible to name: safety. The idea that maybe, just maybe, they weren't going to die tonight. The American soldiers had 1 quart of water per person each day. The prisoners were allotted half that according to regulations. Disease had cut through both sides with impartial cruelty. Malaria, dysentery, jungle rot, turning enemies into equals under the same fever, the same delirium, the same desperate need for water and rest, and just one moment without pain. Kimiko coughed, a wet rattling sound, whispered something in Japanese that Haruko barely caught. Why the older nurse had no answer. Maybe pity, maybe protocol, maybe just humanity bleeding through the cracks in a war that had tried very hard to beat it out of everyone involved. Reports from that time show infection rates in frontline field camps exceeding 40%. Medical orderlies often work through nights without morphine or rest, improvising bandages from torn shirts, boiling instruments in dented pots, saving lives with nothing but skill and stubbornness and the refusal to let one more person die if they could help it. One of those shirts now wrapped around Kimiko's wrist, torn fabric but clean, a name tag still visible in faded ink. O'Hara J. Hours passed. The rain softened to a whisper. Haruko noticed the medic sleeping a few feet away. His rifle was out of reach, leaning against the far tent pole, 10, maybe 12 feet away. He'd have to get up, cross the tent, reach for it. Plenty of time for someone to do something if they wanted. She realized something that unsettled her, deeply cut through the weariness and fear and confusion, and landed somewhere she couldn't ignore. He trusted them. The Empire had preached that Western men saw them as less than human, as objects, as things to be used and discarded. Yet here he was asleep in their presence, unguarded, vulnerable. When morning came, Kimiko's fever had broken, sweat-soaked but breathing easier. The blanket stayed draped over both of them. So did the silence, heavy and full of things neither woman knew how to say. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first night they didn't dream of dying. The first night the darkness felt less absolute. The first night that survival felt like something other than prolonged execution. The bed was no longer an insult. It was survival shared under the same storm. 2 women and 4 men breathing the same thick air, sleeping the same depleted sleep, surviving the same impossible night. And soon that survival would challenge everything they believed about their own nation's honor, about what mercy meant, about who deserved it and who didn't, about whether the enemy was the one holding the gun or the one who'd put it in their hands. By the 4th morning, something impossible had settled into the air like humidity. Routine. The Japanese nurses were being fed on schedule now. A scoop of rice, a sliver of canned meat that came from tins marked with English words they couldn't read. Sometimes powdered milk mixed with water until it turned gray-white and almost drinkable. They ate in silence, side by side with the very men they'd been told were beasts. The men who were supposed to brutalize them, defile them, prove every piece of propaganda right. Instead, the Americans mostly ignored them, passed the food, ate their own, moved on with their day. Kimiko couldn't stop staring at the soap, a small bar wrapped in paper. The medic had handed it to her that morning without comment, just set it beside her rice bowl and walked away. She hadn't touched real soap since 1944, more than a year of washing in rivers, in rain, in whatever water she could find. Her hands had forgotten what clean felt like. Back home, Japanese officers had slapped them for asking for food before their male comrades. A soldier eats first, they'd said. Hunger is discipline. Pain is patriotism. Sacrifice is duty. Yet here the enemy gave them medicine first, food second, dignity without asking for it, without demanding anything in return. That alone tore through years of indoctrination faster than any bomb, more completely than any battle. Every evening the medic named O'Hara walked through the tent, counting heads, checking pulses, scribbling notes in a small journal he kept in his breast pocket. His supplies seemed endless, gauze appearing from nowhere, disinfectant in brown bottles, clean bandages every single day. The nurses whispered among themselves when he was out of earshot. How do they never run out? They didn't know it yet, but American logistics were an empire of their own, a vast machine that churned across oceans, that turned factories in Detroit into field hospitals in the Philippines, that made sure every soldier, every prisoner, every body that needed supplies got them. Maybe not quickly, maybe not perfectly, but consistently, relentlessly. The calorie allotment for prisoners hovered between 2,000 and 2,500 per day, double what most Imperial soldiers received on a good week, triple what nurses got. It wasn't generosity, it was policy. Geneva Convention requirements followed to the letter because someone somewhere had decided that rules mattered even when everything else had fallen apart. The women began comparing quietly, memories spoken in whispers when the Americans were asleep or out of the tent. One recalled an officer back in Manchuria who broke her ribs for fainting on duty, said she was weak, said weakness dishonored the emperor, said a lot of things while his fist made sure she'd remember them. Another remembered sleeping in snow without blankets during the winter of '44. Remembered the cold so complete it stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing, like the absence of everything. Now an enemy medic offered her aspirin for a headache, just handed her 2 white tablets and a cup of water. Didn't ask why, didn't demand gratitude, just treated pain like it was worth treating. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to make sense. Better than our own, Kimiko murmured one night, eyes fixed on the steaming ration tin in her hands. The words came out flat, not grateful, just disbelieving. It wasn't said with joy. It was said with the slow, creeping horror of someone realizing that everything they'd been taught was backwards. The war had turned morality inside out, made the enemy into something they didn't have words for, made mercy into a weapon more devastating than bullets. The tent smelled of boiled rice and damp canvas, of bodies too long without proper washing, of medicine and mud and the particular staleness of air that never quite moves. For the first time in weeks, laughter crept in, soft, uneasy, human. A sergeant cracked a joke in English. The women couldn't understand the words, but his tone wasn't cruel, wasn't mocking, just tired men finding something, anything to smile about. The nurses smiled back, awkward, uncertain, but real. For one fleeting second, the word enemy didn't fit anyone inside that tent. For one impossible moment, they were just people, sick people, tired people, people trying to survive one more day in a world that seemed determined to kill them all. Outside, thunder rolled over Luzon's hills, a long, low rumble that shook the ground. Inside, something gentler took its place, a fragile understanding, unspoken, barely acknowledged, but there. Maybe survival didn't have to feel like betrayal. Maybe living through the war wasn't the same as dishonoring the dead. Maybe mercy could exist, even here in this tent that smelled of sickness and sweat between people who were supposed to hate each other. But with that realization came something heavier, something that would follow Haruko for the rest of her life: guilt. And guilt, she would soon learn, can keep you awake longer than fear ever could. Night again, the kind that presses down on your chest like a physical weight. the kind that makes breathing feel like work. Inside the tent, everyone breathed in rhythm, one vast lung of fatigue rising and falling in the humid darkness. Kimiko lay awake, eyes open to the flicker of the oil lamp that someone had forgotten to extinguish, or maybe left burning on purpose. Maybe some fears needed light to keep them at bay. She wasn't trembling anymore. That had stopped days ago, but she was remembering faces, names, the men she tried to save when her hospital collapsed under mortar fire. 70% of her unit had died before capture. The math was simple and brutal. 200 became 60, 60 became 15, 15 became 2. Her closest friend, Sachiko, had chosen to step into a grenade rather than surrender, had looked at Kimiko one last time with eyes that were already dead, had whispered something that might have been forgiveness or might have been condemnation, then gone. Now here Kimiko was, alive, under a blanket that smelled faintly of American tobacco, being fed by the enemy, sleeping beside men who were supposed to be monsters. Mercy felt heavier than shame ever had. She turned her head toward the cot beside her. O'Hara the medic was asleep, one arm across his eyes as if blocking out dreams he didn't want to see. His chest rose and fell in slow, weary rhythm. The rhythm of a man who'd learned to sleep through anything because the alternative was madness. Kimiko noticed his scars, not from whips or punishment, not the marks of cruelty. These were work scars, burns from touching hot metal, knife nicks from field surgery, the map of a life lived too close to other people's pain. He'd handed her water earlier without hesitation, then stitched a stranger's wound with the same hands that might have loaded a rifle days before, might have killed someone who looked like her brother, might have done terrible things in the name of victory. But right now, those hands were just hands, scarred and dirty and human. Why didn't they avenge them, she whispered in Japanese, meaning her fallen comrades, meaning Sachiko, meaning everyone who died believing the propaganda about American brutality. The question dissolved into the humid air. No one answered because no one understood the words. But maybe that was better. Maybe some questions weren't meant to be answered, just asked, just carried. Maybe they were too tired to hate. Maybe mercy was their rebellion. Outside, rain turned the camp into a swamp. Somewhere in the distance, a generator sputtered and coughed. The nurses could hear the faint hum of trucks arriving. Supply convoys that never seemed to stop. Day or night, rain or shine. The machinery of American logistics grinding forward with mechanical certainty. Compared to the emptiness of their own empire's supply lines, this abundance felt like sorcery, like some kind of magic trick that shouldn't be possible. Kimiko closed her eyes and tried to pray. The old prayers, the ones her grandmother had taught her before the war when the world still made sense. But the prayer faltered halfway through, stuck on words that no longer fit, on ideas that felt hollow. She no longer knew who deserved forgiveness. The Americans for being kind, herself for accepting that kindness. The empire for lying. Her officers for believing the lies. She only knew she was alive because her enemy had chosen not to see her as one. Sleep crept in on slow, reluctant waves. Between dreams, she saw the faces of her friends, the ghosts of men who died whispering Tenoheka Banzai. Long live the emperor, their final words spent on a man who'd never know their names. But in this tent, that war cry sounded meaningless, empty, like screaming into wind that carried the sound away before it could matter. The empire had promised them honor through death, glory through sacrifice, meaning through suffering. Yet this stranger's kindness was showing her a different kind of survival. One rooted not in flags or emperors or nations, but in small, unspoken mercies, in water given freely, in blankets shared without ceremony, in the quiet choice to see suffering and try to ease it. And when morning came, she would find proof that mercy wasn't a fluke, wasn't some isolated incident she could explain away as weakness or strategy or anything other than what it was. It was infrastructure. It was policy. It was the machinery of a nation that had decided somewhere in its laws and regulations and bureaucratic procedures that even enemies deserve basic human dignity. And that realization would shake her more than any battle ever had. The next morning broke with the rumble of engines, deep, mechanical, growing louder with each passing minute until it felt like the ground itself was shaking. The nurses stepped outside the tent for the first time in days. Real sunlight, real air. not the stale recycled breath of canvas walls. Then they froze. Convoys, rows of them, rolling through the muddy clearing like some kind of military parade. 15 trucks at least, maybe 20, each one stacked high with crates stamped in English. Words they couldn't read but somehow understood anyway. The air reeked of diesel and rubber and roasted coffee. That last smell hit hardest. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the burnt grain substitute they'd been drinking for years. The actual thing. Every hour new supplies arrived. Cigarettes in cartons of 200. Medicine in crates the size of coffins. Boots. Uniforms. Chocolate bars wrapped in wax paper. Gasoline in drums that gleamed dully in the morning sun. It was as if the Americans had built an entire city out of abundance, out of the simple assumption that supplies would always come, always arrive, always be there when needed. For women raised on scarcity, it felt like visiting another planet. Haruko remembered rationing back home, scraping rice from the bottom of pots until the metal showed through, boiling weeds for soup because there was nothing else, sewing uniforms from curtains, cutting bandages from bedsheets, making everything last because nothing was coming to replace it. The Empire's radio had told them that America was weak, decadent, dying from within, soft from luxury, unable to sustain a real war. Yet here they stood, watching men unload food faster than her army had ever moved bullets. Reports from that year describe over 16 million tons of American supplies shipped across the Pacific. 16 million. The nurses didn't know the number, but they could see its weight in motion. Feel it in the organized chaos of jeeps buzzing and cranes clanking and barrels rolling off truck beds. Even the smell of the fuel felt like power, like certainty, like the physical manifestation of industrial might. One whispered in Japanese, "Their war runs on wheels." Haruko realized something that settled in her stomach like cold stone. The Americans didn't look victorious. They looked efficient, tired but organized, moving with the casual confidence of men who knew the supplies would keep coming because they always did. Their strength didn't come from speeches or slogans or divine wind. It came from systems, from factories in cities with names like Chicago and Detroit, from farms in places called Iowa and Kansas, from a vast churning machine that turned raw materials into victory with mechanical precision. She thought about the hollow promises of the Imperial Command, the ones that starved her unit while factories burned in Osaka, while supply ships sank in waters they no longer controlled, while soldiers ate tree bark and called it sustenance. Here, every soldier seemed fed, every wound tended, every need met, not perfectly, not luxuriously, but consistently, reliably. O'Hara was writing in his logbook, checking inventory, making notes in small, careful handwriting. He caught their stares and grinned, not mockingly, just the tired smile of a man who'd seen this enough times that it stopped being impressive. "Resupply day," he said casually, wiping sweat off his brow with the back of his hand. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the rhythm. Relief, satisfaction, the tone of a man checking off a box on a list that would be checked again next week and the week after that. This wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. The deep, unshakable knowledge that the machine would keep running because that's what machines did. That night, the echo of truck engines still vibrated through the jungle. The sound had become part of the landscape, part of the air itself. Kimiko whispered to Haruko in the darkness of their shared tent, "They can't lose." Haruko didn't respond immediately, just lay there under the wool blanket, thinking. Not because of guns, Kimiko continued, but because of everything behind them. The farms, the factories, the fuel lines stretching across oceans. The ships that keep coming, no matter how many sink. For the first time she realized the war had been over long before Japan surrendered. Over the moment industrial capacity entered the equation. Over when logistics became destiny. You can't beat a nation that ships Coca-Cola to the front lines for morale. You can't defeat an army that has so much food it can feed its prisoners better than you fed your own soldiers. The math was simple and brutal and undeniable. In the glow of the lantern, Haruko watched a mechanic grease a Jeep axle. Methodical, unhurried, taking care of equipment because tomorrow there would be another convoy and another mission, and the Jeep needed to work. This is victory, she thought. Undramatic, methodical, unstoppable. Not the glorious charge, not the honorable death, just maintenance and supply chains in the grinding, inexorable advance of a war machine that never ran out of fuel. And as she looked back at O'Hara adjusting medical crate labels, checking expiration dates on morphine bottles, she knew this machine of mercy had changed the world's math forever. But mercy once seen demanded a price she wasn't ready to pay. That evening, as the convoys faded into the jungle horizon, the medic named James O'Hara sat on an overturned ammo crate. His hands trembled slightly as he rolled a cigarette, the kind of tremble that comes from nerves frayed too thin for too long. The rain had finally stopped. The ground was still mud, but at least nothing was falling from the sky. Small mercies, the kind you learn to appreciate when bigger ones were in short supply. The nurses watched him from the tent doorway, this young man with mud-caked boots and eyes that looked decades older than his face. He couldn't have been more than 24, maybe 25, but his eyes were ancient. Without warning, he spoke. His English was soft, slow, like someone confessing to the dark rather than to any particular person. My brother. He tapped the side of his helmet. The dented metal made a hollow sound, then pointed toward the stars just beginning to appear through breaking clouds. The women didn't understand the words, but his tone carried the ache, deep and old and still fresh somehow. Grief doesn't age. It just sits there waiting. He mimed an explosion, hands spreading outward, the universal language of violent death. They nodded, silent, understanding without words. O'Hara forced a crooked smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes because the eyes have forgotten how. He exhaled smoke and held the cigarette out to them. Haruko hesitated. This was his last one. She could see the empty pack crumpled beside him. In a culture built on scarcity, in a world where every resource was precious, offering your last cigarette meant something. She took it. The tobacco was harsh, American, different from what she remembered from before the war. But the gesture transcended taste, transcended nationality, transcended everything except the shared understanding that loss was loss regardless of which flag you saluted. In that moment, she saw something unbearable. Grief that looked exactly like her own. Grief that didn't speak Japanese or English or any language except the universal tongue of absence. Or reports say over 12,000 American medics died in the Pacific Theater. Many unarmed, many refusing to abandon patients under fire. Many dying while trying to save the lives of men who would have died anyway. O'Hara was one of the few who'd survived. His body bore the proof, a deep scar along his shoulder where a bullet had carved a groove through muscle. Not deep enough to kill, deep enough to remember. Another mark across his calf. Shrapnel, probably. A constellation of smaller scars that told a story of proximity to violence. He looked nothing like the monsters imperial propaganda had painted. No horns, no fangs, no demonic eyes filled with bloodlust and cruelty. Just a tired man who'd lost his brother and spent every day since trying to save someone else's. When he stitched a wound, his hand shook. Not from cruelty or indifference, from memory, from the weight of everyone he couldn't save. Everyone who'd bled out while he pressed bandages to injuries too severe for bandages to fix. He treated even Japanese soldiers without flinching, without hesitation. The same care he gave Americans, the same desperate efficiency. The nurses began to understand what their officers never could, what the Empire's ideology couldn't accommodate. This man's compassion wasn't weakness. It was rebellion. Rebellion against the war itself, against the machinery of death, against the idea that humans were meant to be enemies rather than just humans. Later that night, they sat beside him as he cleaned instruments under lantern light. Methodical, careful, each tool placed exactly where it belonged. Kimiko handed him a rag without being asked. Their fingers brushed. Just for a second. No words. No fear. Just the fragile rhythm of people too tired to hate. He grieved like us, she whispered in Japanese, not knowing he'd feel the weight of it even without translation. When O'Hara stood to leave, he paused by the cot, glanced back once. His expression was unreadable, spent beyond words, but not cruel, never cruel. Get some rest. She didn't catch the words, but the softness of his voice stayed with her long after he was gone, stayed with her through the night, through the days that followed. through 42 years of remembering. That night, the camp fell into silence. But something had shifted. Some invisible wall had cracked. War's language had changed. From orders to gestures, from violence to care. From seeing enemies to seeing people who happened to be on different sides of a conflict neither had chosen. And by morning, that fragile understanding would lead to something neither side expected: collaboration. By dawn, the line between patient and prisoner had almost vanished. The nurses no longer sat apart. They worked. When O'Hara limped into the tent that morning, leg bothering him more than usual, he found them already at the surgical table, cleaning, folding gauze, boiling instruments in a dented steel pot that had probably been a cooking vessel before the war repurposed it. No one had ordered them to help. No one had asked. They just moved, instinctively, because doing something felt better than remembering everything, because hands needed work or they'd shake, because being useful was the only thing that kept the guilt at bay. The tent buzzed with low voices and clinking metal. A wounded Marine groaned nearby. His leg was wrapped in rough bandages, dark stains seeping through. Infection. Maybe. Probably. Without hesitation, Haruko stepped forward. She'd done this before. Field amputations, blood transfusions, morphine counts scribbled on whatever paper was available. She'd saved men bleeding from wounds that should have killed them. She'd failed to save men with injuries that shouldn't have. She reached for fresh cloth, clean bandages from the seemingly endless supply. O'Hara watched quietly for a moment, then handed her a pair of tweezers, made eye contact, nodded. Good job. 2 words, simple, basic English, no politics in them, no pity, just recognition, just one professional acknowledging another. That small nod broke something wide open inside her, something that had been locked tight since capture, since the hospital collapse, since the moment survival became more complicated than death. It wasn't forgiveness she felt. It was competence rediscovered, purpose. The thing that had defined her before the war turned her into a category, into a prisoner, into a woman who dishonored her nation by choosing to live. The empire had told her she existed to serve men, to die quietly if captured, to accept whatever fate the enemy chose for her. But here her skill mattered again. Her knowledge, her steady hands and quick assessment and years of training that didn't care about flags or emperors or propaganda. Kimiko stood beside her, watching, learning. When O'Hara corrected her bandage fold, showed her a better way to secure the gauze, she smiled, shy, uncertain, but real. They understood nothing of each other's language, yet everything of each other's weariness, everything of the weight that comes from trying to save lives in a world determined to end them. Reports from the final months of the war suggest more than 25,000 Japanese prisoners ended up assisting Allied medics in makeshift hospitals across the Pacific. The war machine was collapsing, supply lines breaking, order dissolving into chaos. But human instinct, the drive to heal, to help, to do something useful with hands that remembered how that didn't collapse. That persisted through defeat and shame and the complete destruction of everything they had been taught to believe. By midday, the tent smelled like alcohol and boiled canvas and sweat. O'Hara scribbled in his notebook, making lists, tracking inventory. He didn't call them enemy anymore. Didn't even call them prisoners, really. He wrote assistants, helper 1, helper 2, simple designations that stripped away everything except function. Outside, thunder rolled again, the afternoon storm building with tropical inevitability. But this time the women didn't flinch, didn't freeze. They were too busy saving a stranger's life. Haruko pressed a bandage to a bleeding chest. Marine, maybe 20, face pale from blood loss. She whispered a prayer she hadn't dared say in months. Not to the emperor, not to the nation, just to whatever force in the universe listened when humans asked for help. O'Hara met her eyes across the wounded man, understanding the gesture if not the words, knowing that some things transcended translation. That prayer was prayer, that trying to save a life was the same in any language. They trusted our hands, Haruko would later recall, her voice still filled with wonder decades after the fact. Not because they were Japanese or female, but because for a few fleeting days they were just people trying to stop the dying. Eddie Chen, the Chinese-American medic, who'd been so hostile at first, handed her a fresh bandage without being asked. His grandmother had died in Nanking. His family had suffered under Japanese occupation. He had every reason to let these women drown in shame and isolation. Instead, he worked beside them. Not warmly, not with friendship, but with the professional courtesy of one medic recognizing others. By evening, they'd saved 3 men who probably should have died. Not miracles, just competent medical care applied quickly enough to matter. Captain Brooks made his rounds, checking on patients, reviewing O'Hara's notes. He paused when he saw the notation about Japanese assistance. He didn't order them to stop, didn't question it, just nodded and moved on. Because in a field hospital where men were dying from preventable infections, competent hands were competent hands. Period. But every war's mercy comes with an aftershock. Every kindness extracts a price. Every moment of collaboration plants seeds of guilt that would take years to grow. And when the fighting finally ended, when the radio crackled with news of surrender, and the future suddenly became real instead of theoretical, peace would not feel like freedom. It would feel like exile, like the beginning of a different kind of war. One fought not with bullets, but with shame. Not on battlefields, but in the eyes of family and strangers, and everyone who would judge them for the crime of surviving mercy. The reckoning was coming, and it would be worse than anything they'd faced in that tent. The war ended like a door slammed shut, sudden, echoing, final. Word of Japan's surrender reached the camp through a crackling radio in mid-August 1945. Static, then voices speaking too fast in English, the prisoners couldn't quite follow. But you didn't need to understand the words. You could hear it in the tone, in the sudden shift from tension to something else. Relief, maybe, or just weariness finally allowed to surface. Some Americans cheered, not many, just a few voices rising above the general murmur. Others sat in silence, too drained to feel victory, too hollowed out by months of jungle fever and death to know what winning was supposed to feel like. The Japanese nurses didn't cheer at all. They simply stared at the horizon, trying to imagine what home even meant now, trying to picture walking back into a world that had moved on without them, that had probably declared them dead already, that might not want them back. Weeks later, transport ships carried them back across the Pacific, cargo vessels converted for repatriation, 300 Japanese prisoners crammed into holds that still smelled of diesel and machine oil. Most were soldiers. Maybe 20 were women. Haruko and Kimiko stayed close in the cramped space below deck, clutching the wool blanket between them. Haruko had folded it carefully into her small suitcase. Contraband, against regulations. But she'd taken it anyway, hidden it under the thin layer of clothes they'd been issued for the journey home. The blanket was proof that mercy had existed, proof that she'd survived it, proof that everything that came after was built on that foundation of unexpected kindness. Other women sat in silence, faces hard, eyes empty, already rehearsing the lies they'd need to tell, already preparing for rejection. The ship was cramped but clean. American rations continued even in repatriation. Haruko realized the irony that twisted in her stomach even here. Returning them to freedom, the enemy treated them better than their own army ever had. The contradiction would follow her home like a shadow. Guards kept their distance but weren't cruel, just professional, doing it too, counting heads, making sure no one jumped overboard, making sure the prisoners, former prisoners, became someone else's problem as quickly and efficiently as possible. One evening, standing on deck as the ship cut through dark water, a woman from a different camp approached, maybe 30, burn scars on her arms, eyes that had seen things she'd never speak about. "Will your family take you back?" she asked in Japanese, her voice flat, already knowing the answer. Another woman younger, maybe 19, answered before Haruko could. "I'll tell them I was killed. Easier that way. Cleaner." Kimiko turned away from the rail. "Can we lie about capture? Can we just say we were in a field hospital that evacuated before the Americans arrived?" Haruko shook her head. "Everyone will know. Americans kept records. Red Cross visited. There are lists, documents, proof. We can't erase what happened just because we wish we could." The conversation died. What else was there to say? They were sailing toward home, toward family, toward the nation they'd served and bled for. and none of them wanted to arrive. Yokohama appeared on the horizon on a gray morning in late August. The city was unrecognizable. Ashes, rubble, buildings reduced to skeletal frames. The smell of smoke still hung in the air even though the fires had been out for weeks. The dock was chaos, thousands of people waiting, desperate faces scanning each new arrival, holding signs with names written in shaky characters, searching for sons, husbands, brothers, anyone who might have survived. The women disembarked in a separate group, kept apart from male prisoners as if contamination was still possible, as if whatever had happened to them might spread. American soldiers processed them efficiently, professional, impersonal, stamping papers, taking names, making sure everyone got sorted into the right line for the right train to the right prefecture. Japanese officials waited at tables set up along the dock. Their faces were harder, shame evident in the way they wouldn't quite make eye contact, in the way their mouths tightened when they looked at the women. Status 1 official said flatly to Haruko, his pen poised over a form. "Return from enemy territory," she answered, using the official phrase, the one that would follow her forever. He stamped her papers, red ink, bold characters, a mark that might as well have been a brand. Permanent record, permanent stain. Kimiko's family was there. Her mother, her younger brother, standing apart from the main crowd, waiting. Kimiko saw them and started running, arms outstretched, face breaking into something that might have been joy or might have been desperation. Hard to tell anymore. Her mother stepped back, just one step, but it might as well have been a mile. "Where is your honor?" her mother said. Not a question, an accusation, the only greeting offered. Kimiko froze, arms falling to her sides, face collapsing. Her brother wouldn't look at her, just stared at his shoes. 17 years old and already learning the family art of shame. Haruko watched from a distance, seeing her own future in that moment, understanding that they were already ghosts, already erased, already dead to the world they tried so hard to survive for. The train to Nagasaki took 2 days. The landscape rolled past the windows, burned, destroyed, fields left fallow, villages reduced to ash. The whole country looked like it had been hollowed out and left to rot. Other passengers avoided her, saw the red stamp on her papers when she showed them at checkpoints, saw the mark, moved to different seats, whispered to each other. That's one of them, the ones who were captured. Can you imagine the shame? Nagasaki was worse than she'd imagined. The entire city was flattened, not from conventional bombing, from something else, something that had turned buildings to shadows and people to memories. The atomic bomb. August 9th, while she'd been in that tent in Luzon, while she'd been eating bacon and learning to work beside the enemy, while she'd been surviving. Her city had been dying. The train station was temporary structures, wood and canvas, nothing permanent because nothing could be permanent anymore. She found her way to the address where her family's temporary shelter was supposed to be, a wooden shack on the outskirts of what used to be a neighborhood. No landmarks remained, no familiar streets, just mud and debris and people moving like ghosts through a landscape of ghosts. Her mother opened the door, 50s, but aged 20 years in the months since Haruko had last seen her. Gray hair, hollow cheeks, eyes that had seen too much. "You're alive," her mother said, not with joy, just statement, observation. "The way you'd comment on weather," Father Haruko asked, even though she already knew, could feel the answer in the air. Died August 9th, trying to save patients at the hospital, the same hospital where he'd taught her to tie sutures, where she'd learned that healing was the only thing worth doing in a world determined to destroy. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," Haruko said, the guilt crushing her chest. "You were with Americans." Her mother's tone made it clear. That was worse. Being absent was bad, but being absent because you were with them, that was unforgivable. Reiko emerged from the back room, Haruko's younger sister, 18 now, burn scars visible on her arms. Radiation sickness evident in her thinness, in the way she moved like every step hurt. "What did they do to you?" Reiko asked. No greeting, no embrace, just the question that mattered. "They fed me, gave me medicine, kept me alive." Nothing else. Reiko's eyes were hard, suspicious, already not believing, nothing else. "I don't believe you." said flat. Final. The end of any possibility of understanding. That night, Haruko unpacked in a corner of the single room they all shared, pulled out the wool blanket, unfolded it carefully. The wool was thinner now after those months. The smell had faded to memory, but the tag remained. U.S. Army Medical Department. Proof that couldn't be erased by time. Reiko saw it, saw the letter still visible despite wear. You kept their things. Her voice rising, sharp with disgust. It kept me warm, Haruko said quietly. Reiko grabbed for it, tried to pull it away, throw it out, erase the evidence of survival that looked too much like collaboration. Haruko fought back, actually fought, grabbed the blanket and pulled, hard enough that Reiko stumbled. This blanket is proof, Haruko said, voice shaking, not from fear, from anger, from months of holding everything and finally breaking through. Proof of what your shame, proof that mercy exists, that humans can choose kindness even in war, that the enemy treated me better than our own officers ever did. The words hung in the air, impossible to take back. Their mother spoke from the doorway, her voice cold. Final. Hide it. Never speak of capture. Never mention Americans. Never tell anyone what happened. Do you understand why I survived? That's not shameful. That's not wrong. Survival is an honor. Her mother's voice broke, just slightly. You should have. She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Haruko understood. You should have died. That's what you mean. You'd rather I died than came home like this. Silence, the kind that confirms everything. Haruko folded the blanket, put it at the bottom of her small trunk, covered it with clothes, buried the proof because proof was too dangerous to display. But she didn't throw it away. Couldn't. It was all she had left of the days when survival felt like something other than betrayal. The years that followed were a slow erosion, a grinding away of identity and hope in any possibility of normal life. 1946 through 1950. Haruko applied to hospitals, clinics, anywhere that needed medical help. Post-war Japan was desperate for trained nurses, desperate for anyone who could set bones and stitch wounds and help rebuild. Every application was rejected. Reason POW record. Returned from enemy territory. Tainted by association with the enemy. She tried temples, seeking some kind of spiritual solace, some way to make sense of survival. The monks refused her blessing, said she'd been contaminated by enemy contact, said prayers wouldn't work for someone who'd lived among Americans, who'd accepted their food and medicine and mercy. A matchmaker approached her mother. There was a man, a widower, not desirable but willing to consider her despite her past. The meeting lasted 10 minutes. He asked one question. Were you violated by Americans, number? I was treated with basic human dignity. He left without another word. Basic human dignity from the enemy was somehow worse than violation. At least violation could be pitied, could be understood, could fit into the narrative of victimhood. But choosing to work alongside them, accepting their kindness, that was collaboration. That was betrayal. That was unforgivable. Statistical reality bore out her experience. Surveys from post-war Japan revealed that over 60% of repatriated female prisoners never married. The mark on their papers, the red stamp that said they'd been in enemy hands, that was enough to poison entire lives. Kimiko's letters arrived sporadically through those years. Brief, increasingly desperate. 1946, mother won't speak to me. I work in factory. Night shift. No one knows me there. 1948, engaged. He's kind. He doesn't know about capture. I haven't told him. I know I should. I will. Soon. 1950, engagement broken. Someone from my village told him. He won't see me, won't answer letters. His family says I brought shame. 1951, don't write anymore. It's better if I forget. Better if everyone forgets. I need to disappear into normal life somehow. Your letters remind me of things I need to bury. After that silence, Haruko wrote twice more. Both letters returned unopened. Address unknown. Whether Kimiko had moved or simply refused delivery, Haruko never knew. 1953, a brief notice in the Osaka newspaper. Factory worker age 30 died in accident. The name wasn't Kimiko's birth name. But Haruko recognized the date of birth. the prefecture, the carefully worded phrases that said suicide without saying it. She folded the newspaper clipping, put it in the trunk beside the blanket. Two kinds of proof, one of mercy, one of its cost. Kimiko had chosen a different kind of disappearance, not into normal life, into nothing at all. Haruko never told anyone. Some deaths were too private for witness, some shame too heavy for sharing. She just kept the clipping, kept the memory, kept the knowledge that survival wasn't always victory. The 50s and 60s passed in gray monotony. Haruko found work in a factory, sewing uniforms. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once worn the uniform, served the nation, bled for it. Now she sewed them for others. Anonymous, invisible, useful only as hands that could operate a machine. She lived alone in a small room. 6 tatami mats, shared bathroom down the hall, walls thin enough to hear neighbors. Thin enough that they could hear her too. So she learned to be quiet, to move silently, to exist without taking up space. The blanket stayed folded in her closet. She never used it, never displayed it. But winter nights when the cold cut through the thin walls and sleep wouldn't come, she'd take it out, unfold it, sit with it draped over her shoulders, and remember. Remember O'Hara's tired smile. Remember Morrison's gruff kindness. Remember Chen's slow softening from hostility to professional respect. Remember the taste of bacon, the smell of coffee, the weight of competence rediscovered. Remember feeling safe, even if just for a few weeks, even if just in a tent that smelled of sickness and sweat, even if just sleeping beside men who were supposed to be monsters. You are kinder than my own, she'd whisper to the empty room, knowing it was true, knowing it was dangerous, knowing she could never say it aloud to anyone who might hear. Reiko married in 1955, had children, invited Haruko to the wedding but asked her to sit in the back. Please don't mention your past. Please don't tell my husband's family. Please just be quiet and unremarkable and forgettable. Haruko attended, sat where she was told, said nothing. Watched her sister marry into a respectable family. Watched her sister get the life that should have been possible for both of them. At the reception, someone asked how they were related. Reiko's husband answered before Reiko could. My wife's sister. She was sick during the war. Couldn't serve. A polite fiction, a lie that preserved everyone's honor except Haruko's. Their mother died in 1968, deathbed in a hospital that smelled like disinfectant and old sorrow. Haruko sat beside her, holding a hand that had stopped being warm days earlier. You dishonored the family, her mother whispered, voice barely audible. But you're still my daughter. I tried to survive, Haruko said. That's all. I just tried to live. I know, that's what dishonors you. Survival when death would have been honorable. Life when sacrifice would have been meaningful. Coming home when staying gone would have been easier for everyone. She died an hour later, without reconciliation, without forgiveness, without ever understanding that her daughter's survival was a victory, not a shame. The 70s passed. Japan rebuilt itself into neon and factories, an economic miracle. The whole nation transformed, rose from ashes, became something new and powerful and wealthy. But Haruko remained stuck, frozen in 1945, in that tent, in that impossible moment when the enemy chose mercy and the choice broke everything she'd believed. 1985, an announcement on NHK television. The National Broadcasting Company was doing a documentary project, seeking testimonies from former POWs, particularly women, particularly those whose stories had never been told. Promise of anonymity if desired. Promise of respectful treatment. Promise that maybe finally someone wanted to hear the truth. Haruko watched the announcement, sitting in her small room, 68 years old, retired from the factory, living on a pension that barely covered rent and food. Who would believe me, she thought? Who would want to hear that Americans were kind, that they fed us and healed us and treated us like humans? Who would accept that the enemy was better than our own? She didn't call the number on screen, didn't write, didn't reach out. The fear was too deep, the shame too ingrained. 40 years of silence couldn't be broken by a television announcement, but the seed was planted, the idea that maybe someone somewhere might understand. Winter 1986. Haruko visited a temple, different from the one that had refused her blessing decades earlier. This one had a young monk, maybe 30, face kind, eyes that suggested he'd seen suffering and learned compassion from it. She prayed, not for forgiveness anymore, just for understanding, for some way to carry the weight without being crushed by it. The monk approached after, asked if she needed to talk, if something troubled her. I carry a secret, she said slowly. That feels like shame but might be grace. I don't know anymore. I've carried it so long I can't tell the difference. The monk nodded. All secrets become heavier with time. Consider speaking them, even if no one hears, even if no one understands. Speaking them makes them real instead of just weight. She left without saying more. But the idea stayed with her, grew, took root. 1987, December, snow falling over Tokyo, rare for the city, beautiful in its rarity. Reiko's granddaughter came to visit, Ayumi, 16, bright-eyed, curious about the world in the way only the young can be. She had a school project, interview someone who lived through the war, get their story, preserve history before it disappeared with the generation that lived it. Great aunt, she said politely, respectfully. Would you talk to me about the war? Haruko looked at her, this girl who'd never known hunger, never known fear, never known what it meant to choose between honor and survival. This girl who lived in a Japan that bore no resemblance to the one Haruko had grown up in. What do you want to know? Haruko asked carefully. What was it really like? Silence. 30 seconds, a minute, the weight of 42 years pressing down. The choice of whether to keep lying or finally tell the truth. Then Haruko stood, went to her closet, pulled out the small trunk she'd kept all these years, opened it, moved aside clothes that had been sitting in the same position for decades, and pulled out the wool blanket, faded now, worn thin in places, but still intact, still marked with the tag that said U.S. Army Medical Department. Ayumi stared at it, confusion evident on her face. What is that? She asked. Proof, Haruko said, her voice steady, maybe for the first time in 42 years. She set the blanket on the table between them, set up the tape recorder Ayumi had brought, looked at this girl who represented a future that might finally be ready to hear the past, and she began to speak. The tape recorder clicked on, the small red light indicating it was recording, preserving, making permanent what had been hidden for so long. Ayumi-chan, Haruko began, her voice quiet but clear. Let me tell you what they don't teach in schools. The propaganda said Americans were beasts, rapists, murderers. We believed it absolutely. Every word, every warning, every nightmare scenario they painted for us. We believed because we had to, because doubt was treason. When I was captured, I was prepared to die. I'd seen my friend choose a grenade over surrender, watched her step into death because it was better than dishonor. I understood. I would have done the same if I'd had the chance. But when the American sergeant said, "You'll share this bed with us tonight," I thought, this is how it ends. This is the moment the propaganda proves true. This is when I discover that everything they said was right. She paused, the memory still vivid after all these years, still sharp enough to cut. But they just slept. They snored. They had nightmares about people they'd lost. They offered water when I had fever. They gave me a blanket when I was cold. They said good job when I helped save a life. The enemy taught me humanity. My own country taught me shame. Ayumi was crying, quiet tears running down her face, not understanding yet, but feeling the weight of it. But they were the enemy, she managed to say. That's what I was told. But the enemy fed me bacon for breakfast. Real bacon. The kind I hadn't tasted since before the war. Gave me soap. Clean soap that made me remember what it felt like to be clean. Let me work as a medic instead of rotting as a prisoner. My own officers beat us for asking for food, called us weak, called hunger a form of discipline, called suffering a form of patriotism. Her voice broke, just slightly, the first crack after 42 years of holding it together. For 42 years, I've hidden this blanket. She touched it, fingers tracing the faded tag, because showing it would prove I survived mercy. And surviving mercy from the enemy was worse than being killed by them. Do you understand how twisted that is? How broken the logic? How impossible the choice. Ayumi nodded, not really understanding, but trying, reaching across generations to grasp something that didn't fit into any category she'd been taught. Were they good men, she asked? The simplest question, the hardest to answer. They were tired men, spent men, men who'd seen too much death and decided maybe consciously, maybe not, that they were done killing. That healing was the only thing left worth doing. That Medic O'Hara. His brother died at Saipan. He had every reason to hate us, every justification for cruelty, but he gave me his last cigarette, shared his blanket, treated my fever like it mattered. I don't know if he survived the war. I couldn't search for him. Even asking would invite questions. Questions I wasn't ready to answer. Questions that would bring shame back to the family. But I hope he's alive. I hope he went home to Chicago. I hope he's happy. I hope he knows that his kindness echoed through my entire life, that it kept me alive in ways he'll never understand. The tape kept rolling, capturing words that had waited decades to be spoken. Ayumi sat frozen, the weight of history settling on her shoulders, the understanding that her great-aunt had carried this alone for so long. When Haruko finally finished, when the story was told and the silence returned, Ayumi reached across the table, took her great-aunt's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for surviving, for remembering, for finally telling the truth." 1 week later, Ayumi presented her school project, her great-aunt's war. The classroom was silent. Some students cried, some looked uncomfortable, some didn't believe it, thought it was propaganda or exaggeration or some kind of trick. But the teacher archived the tape, sent a copy to NHK, said this needed to be preserved, needed to be heard, needed to become part of the historical record because truth matters even when it's uncomfortable. 20 years later, in 2007, Ayumi became a documentary filmmaker. Her first film following 5 former female POWs still alive. Haruko's testimony became the centerpiece. The film won awards, traveled to festivals, reached millions, started conversations Japan had avoided for 60 years. When Haruko watched it in a small theater in Nagasaki, aged 90, she cried. Not from shame this time, from relief. The story had outlived the silence. The truth had outlived the lie. Ayumi dedicated the film to my great-aunt, who taught me that mercy is worth remembering. In 1995, NHK aired a documentary, Voices Long Silent, 200 testimonies from former female POWs, all telling variations of the same impossible story, that in the midst of brutality, some people chose mercy, that kindness existed even in war, that the enemy was sometimes more human than your own side. Haruko's testimony was one of them. Anonymous at first, but then she allowed her name to be used, her words reaching people she'd never meet, touching lives she'd never know about. And in 1996, something extraordinary happened, something she'd never dared hope for. The U.S.-Japan Veterans Reconciliation Program connected former POWs with their American captors, brought them together 50 years later, gave them a chance to say the things that had gone unsaid. Among them, Haruko Yamamoto and James O'Hara. They met in San Francisco in May, a hotel conference room filled with old soldiers and former prisoners, gray hair and wrinkles and bodies that remembered war even when minds tried to forget. Haruko saw him across the room, recognized him somehow despite 50 years, despite age, despite everything that should have made him a stranger. She walked over, carrying a small package, the wool blanket, folded carefully, preserved all these years. "I believe this is yours," she said in English. Words she'd practiced for weeks, made sure she got right. O'Hara looked at the blanket, saw the tag. His eyes filled with tears. "Keep it," he said, voice rough with age and emotion. "You earned it, more than I ever did." She kept it. They talked for 2 hours, through translators, through broken sentences and long pauses, through tears and laughter in the strange relief of finally being understood. He told her about Chicago, about the drugstore his parents had run, about going to medical school after the war on the GI Bill, about never quite shaking the nightmares but learning to live with them. She told him about the blanket, about 42 years of hiding, about the shame and the silence and the slow, painful journey to speaking the truth. At the end, he took her hands, looked her in the eyes. You were the bravest patient I ever had, he said. Braver than any soldier, she shook her head. You gave me back my life, not just survival. Life. They stood there, two old people who'd once been enemies, who'd shared a tent in a moment of unexpected humanity, who'd carried each other through decades without knowing it. The photograph from that day shows them standing side by side, her hands clutching the blanket, his arm around her shoulders, both smiling, both finally at peace. James O'Hara died in 2003, age 82, in Chicago, surrounded by family, a good death, the kind you hope for. Haruko Yamamoto died in 2008, age 91, in Nagasaki, the city rebuilt around her. Not alone this time, Ayumi was with her, holding her hand. Her last words were in English, practiced one final time. Thank you. The blanket is now in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, behind glass, preserved for future generations. The label reads, proof that mercy can exist anywhere, even in war, especially in war. More than 4,000 Japanese women were captured as POWs in the Pacific Theater. Most were nurses, most faced rejection when they returned home. Their stories were hidden for decades, buried under shame and silence, and the weight of a nation that couldn't accept its own failure. But their truth remains, unchanging, undeniable. Monsters follow orders. Humans choose mercy. And sometimes the enemy shows us what our own side couldn't. That choice, that small, quiet choice to be human, to see suffering and ease it, to offer water and blankets and basic dignity to people who expected death. That's what truly won the peace. Not the bombs, not the battles, not the grand strategies or the industrial might or the political maneuvering. Just people choosing kindness when cruelty was easier. People choosing to heal when killing was expected. People choosing to see humans instead of enemies. And that choice echoes still, through generations, through history, through the lives touched by mercy when mercy was least expected. If this story moved you, share it. Tell it. Let it remind you that even in the darkest moments, even when the world demands cruelty, humans can choose something better. They can choose mercy. And mercy, once given, never truly dies. It lives on in the people who received it, in the stories they tell, in the blankets they keep, in the proof they carry that kindness is possible, even in impossible times. What stories of unexpected kindness do you carry from your family's past? What moments of mercy do you remember? Tell us in the comments. Share them. Let's build a community that remembers not just the battles, but the humanity that survived them. Because that's what truly matters. Not who won or lost, but who chose to be human. Who chose mercy. Who chose to see past uniforms and flags and propaganda to the person underneath. That's the story worth remembering. That's the truth worth preserving. That's the legacy worth passing down. The bed they shared wasn't just canvas and wood. It was the beginning of understanding, the first step toward peace, the moment when enemies became people and people chose kindness. And 42 years later, when Haruko finally told her story, she gave us all permission to believe that mercy is possible, that humans are capable of extraordinary kindness, even in extraordinary circumstances, that the choice to be good matters more than the choice to be victorious. That's the bed that changed everything. Not just for 2 women and 4 men in a tent in Luzon, but for everyone who hears the story and decides to carry it forward, to choose mercy, to offer blankets, to share water, to see humans instead of enemies. That's how wars truly end, not with treaties or surrenders, but with small acts of kindness that echo through generations. And that echo, that persistent reminder that humans are capable of better, that's worth preserving, worth sharing, worth remembering, always.